All right, last week we covered up through verse 7 of chapter 13. We've been discussing the Christian's responsibility to obey. The phrase we use is the law of the land. That's not necessarily a scripture phrase, but it's obviously implied within the text with regard to the law of the land. We talked last week about taxes. We talked verse 7, render therefore all their due, taxes to whom taxes, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. I did go back and look at that term, customs. It's an interesting term, but it does seem, at least in the context, to be suggesting almost like a toll. People who perhaps aren't citizens, if you're going through another country, you pay what is due to that country. So it covers both citizens within their own country as well as if we're traveling to another country and we say, oh no, I don't know anything to this country. We still need to pay that custom. And of course, the application we made last week still would hold true as well within the customs of a country, even if it's not a written law in that land, but it's a custom that is expected or at least appreciated. It garners favor, and if it doesn't disobey God in any way, then I think that's something obviously that the scriptures teach us to do as well. So fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Now we go on to verse 8. Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. So last week we ended with verse 8. We didn't get a chance to really talk about it. And that's what question 7 in our notes is about. Given what Paul says in verse 8, is it a sin to go into financial debt, such as a mortgage, car loan? Is it a sin to borrow money or other things from people? If not, what does Paul mean?
I've always taken this as to borrow with never the intent to repay.
Okay.
I don't know if that's right.
Okay.
I've always taken this.
Yeah.
That with the intention to pay back, it's not a sin. I mean, there's been parables of the talents where you could at least put it in the bank and
right.
you got usury or interest on it. So I don't think it'd be contradictory
right.
there if it's
right.
wrong to borrow.
Absolutely. Yeah. So,
Michael,
yes, sir.
Even churches borrow.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Even churches borrow money to build a building or have some unexpected expense that they don't have the money to take care of. Sure, that happens. Verse 8, it's not dealing with the concept of, and remember, the context isn't about money. That's not the context. Okay, a lot of times it gets associated to verse 7 because of taxes and obviously customs. But verse 7 isn't so much about taxes as it is about our responsibilities within a nation. Okay, our responsibilities as good citizens. And so when you get to verse 8, when he says, owe no one anything except. Well, remember, we're to also owe fear to whom is due fear. We're to owe honor to whom honor is due. And then in the context, verses 9 and 10, what's he going to describe with regard to our treatment of others? To do good, right? To do no harm. And so when he says, owe no one anything, certainly the literal aspect applies that Doug mentioned about obviously it's not speaking with regard to never owing anyone anything in our financial world. However, it's in a more metaphorical context in which it's describing that we're not to be compromised within ourselves. And that would include the dishonesty, seeking to borrow with no intention to repay or whatnot. But the compromising of oneself, the teaching of God with regard to our character and our treatment of others, the seeking to do harm versus seeking to do good. What we are to owe to another is what? Love. Except to love one another. This is in the context of characteristics. It's not in the context of money. It's characteristics. Now, certainly applications of dealings with money certainly would fall into those categories of how we deal honestly and good with people. But that's not the context of you can't have a mortgage, you can't have a car payment, and that sort of thing. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think in today's society, you've got I'll scratch your back, you scratch my back.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of talking about that. You owe me a favor, I did this for you. So it's not monetary, but it does deal with the character, like you said, because if you did something for me that was a little bit off color, now you might expect me to do something for you that's a little bit off
Yeah.
The conscious.
And that's the compromising of our character, putting us in a position where you think about seedy loan sharks and things like that, where, instead of, just incredible interest, maybe they want you to do something illegal, or, you owe your friend something because you helped him out sometime, and now all of a sudden he wants you to do something that you really shouldn't be doing. Yeah, so that kind of,
White-collar crime.
Yeah,
kind of stuff,
yeah.
Where bosses want people to do stuff that's.
Right.
Christians have lost their jobs over stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
So, it is dealing with the character, but
Sure.
I think to put it in, as the rubber meets the road. So
Right,
it
yeah.
happens very subtly in workplaces.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
things like that.
And it puts us in a position where either to be tempted or to sin. That's what the compromise kind of describes. Doug?
I hate to jump ahead, but I think verse 9 helps understand verse 8.
Sure.
Here that, he starts 4, you commented about this word 4.
Right.
It's connected to verse 8.
Yeah. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. If there's any other commandment, they are all summed up, in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And again, that goes to the character being described. And these are the actions. Notice how each one of these, this isn't just something I do myself, it affects others. Adultery affects others. Murder obviously affects others. Stealing, you're taking something that is possessed by someone else and you're taking it as your own. You bear false witness, that's lying to get someone else in trouble. Okay, that's obviously going to affect someone else. Coveting, and of course you would think that covet is just an internal thing, right?
It affects how you treat it.
It affects how you treat people. When something good happens to somebody, what's the natural emotion that comes from covetousness? Jealousy and envy. Jealousy and envy. If there's any other commandment, all are summed up in this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In this context, is neighbor our fellow Christians, brothers and sisters in Christ?
Yes.
I mean, well, they would be included in that, right? But is it exclusive to them? No. Okay, neighbor. In fact, Jesus, when he talked about the Samaritan, told the parable of the Good Samaritan, he was teaching people what it means to who your neighbor is. Your neighbor is one who needs mercy shown to them. Anyone who needs mercy. So it's not just my next door neighbor. It's not just somebody. Oh, I'm friends with my neighborhood. Okay, it's anyone around me. And so these commandments that have direct impact on others, it kind of ties into what Peter would tell the saints in 1 Peter chapter 3 and chapter 4 about our character within the context of the world, and of course in that context of 1 Peter, persecution, to make sure we suffer. If we suffer for doing good, not for doing evil. And certainly that would apply to here in verse 9. So amidst all of these commandments with regard to our conduct that affects others, owe no one anything except to love one another. Yeah. So verse 8 and verse 9 kind of builds on what he says in verse 8. Anything so far through verses 8 and 9? Which suggests, if I owe somebody, okay, what is that called? A debt, right? Back earlier in chapter 1, Paul considered it a debt to do what? To preach. Yeah. To both the Jews and the Greeks, barbarians, Scythians, didn't matter. He considered it a debt to be paid to his fellow neighbor. And here in verse 8, owe no one anything except to. So what do we owe to others? Love. In fact, that's question 8. What obligation is always owed? Love. Loving our neighbor as ourselves. Okay? And a lot of times we think when we're being kind to somebody or being nice to someone, we do something good for somebody, it's like we're going above and beyond. Okay? Sometimes people get that idea, well, I'm going above and beyond the call of duty here. But is that actually something that is owed on my behalf to that individual because I seek to serve God? Yeah, that's what Paul says. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think when you think of it as you love yourself, how many times do you cut yourself slack?
Yeah,
But you don't cut somebody else's slack.
right.
You know, so if I'm gonna cut.
You excuse yourself, but will you excuse others? Yeah.
Exactly. You know, if I'm gonna forgive myself for something, shouldn't I be just as willing to forgive somebody else? So
Sure.
if you put that as yourself, think about how lenient you are with yourself, and be sure you're that lenient with others.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
We just gotta be careful we don't fall into the trap of expecting the same thing out of them as we do out of others.
Yeah. And so that's the other side of the scale. People who are perfectionists, you know, they expect themselves, everything they do to be perfect. Then sometimes that can even extend to expecting other people to be perfect too, and that's not going to
I think if
happen.
you put it in the context of a young Christian or
Sure.
a new Christian, 20 years ago, I wasn't who I am today.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Everybody grows.
exactly, and so to expect a person that's just learning the truth for the first time, and maybe they don't dress the way we think they should dress, you know, well, maybe I hold myself more accountable for that, but they need time to learn that, just as I learned.
And of course, it's our obligation to help teach them that too. Absolutely.
So out of love, I would teach them.
Right.
To do the right thing, and let them come to it.
Right.
In their time.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. All right. Yes, sir.
I just wondered if perhaps some of Doug's comment is not about perfection, but others who are not Christians or who don't have this training or teaching, you know, if they don't act like that towards us, then we feel like,
Why should I treat them good? Yeah. Yeah. Especially as we already discussed earlier about those who are evil to us or do evil to us. We're not to render evil for evil, chapter 12, but render good. Certainly that kind of ties into that as well. In the face of individuals who show us the opposite of love, okay, maybe hatred, people who despise us for whatever reason, we should still, and of course, we may not love a person's actions or a person's characteristics, but should we love their soul? Okay, and that's what, and God, he so loved the world. He loves all souls, doesn't he? So if God was willing to let his son die for these people who are evil to us, should we be willing to show them patience and love ourselves? Is that easy? No, it's not. But that's what we're called to do. It goes opposite of our natural training. Yeah.
It's interesting that in this, we have the last 5 of the Old Testament commandments. Of course, in context, we don't have the first 5.
Right.
The last 5 is, and then in context with Jesus on the Mount in Matthew 5, it says, "But I say to you, love your enemies, bless them, and curse you, do them that hate you, pray for them that despitefully use you and persecute you. Love them, do good, and pray for them."
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, some of those 10 Commandments being reissued on the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to the recognition that the character of God's people have always been the same. He's expected the same from his people, those who are going to serve him. It doesn't matter if it's the law of Christ, the old law, the patriarchal law, that character of faith, of doing good to others, that's always the same. Yes, ma'am?
We don't get to pick who God loves.
That's right. And yet, sometimes the way at least religious people in the world act, God hates gays, you know. Well, does God hate sin? Sure, but does he hate sinners? No. And unfortunately, there's so much intolerance in this world based on people's own misunderstandings. And it would be much better for everybody if people on both sides, those who are religious and those who are anti-religious, would understand what it means to be kind and loving and try to help each other. Maybe have a little bit more inroads with people doing that way. Anything else through verse 9? All right, let's see. Verse 10, love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Question 9, what law does loving your neighbor as yourself fulfill? Huh?
All of them.
All of them, yeah. All of them. Now, granted, he quoted Old Testament, didn't he? But are all of these commandments reinstituted at some point in the new law? Absolutely. In fact, 9 out of the 10 commandments are reinstituted in the new law. The only one that isn't is to keep the Sabbath day holy. And not that we don't have that, it's more we keep the Lord's Supper holy. Okay, and that Lord's Supper takes place on the first day of the week. Okay, so it's not quite the same, but it's similar in that we do have a day. It's the action that we take, the memorial that we observe on that day, that is to be kept holy. So when he says, and just to kind of verse 10, when he says, "Love does no harm to a neighbor," therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. This term, and remember we talked before about definite article the versus no definite article. A lot of times when Paul refers to the old law, he says it's the law of Moses or the law. Here it's just law. Okay, that is, and of course again it's speaking to the law of God, but it didn't matter what law, patriarchal, old law, new law. It's all the same with regard to God's expectations of character from His people. Yeah. Anything else so far through verse 10? All right. Verse 10 kind of reminds me of what James would say in James chapter 1 at the end of the chapter. The fulfillment of hold on, I'm not going to be able to. I had it and I lost it. He who seeks to fulfill the royal law. Verse 25, the perfect law of liberty. But then there's, let's see, is it chapter 2? Yeah, verse 8. If you really fulfill the royal law according to the Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You do well. Well, the old law was never referred to as the royal law. He's quoting old law, but James is specifically talking about the law of Christ. So it kind of puts me in mind of that when we talk about this type of thing, quoting Old Testament, but then applying it to the new law. Anything else through verse 10?
I kind of wonder why he has to say that, no harm. When you love someone, I wouldn't think that would even be an option.
I know.
But you have to come out and just so direct with that.
You know, and it's not just physical harm, though, either. I mean, can you do harm with words?
Oh, sure.
You can do harm with actions. Isn't that the context of verse 8 and 9? Actions? Sure. And, of course, now, granted, our context is specific application, okay? But certainly, is this going to have a secondary application? I mean, Paul's talking about citizens and being good citizens and all that, but remember the situation in Rome, the Jews and the Gentiles, okay? This secondary application of loving your neighbor as yourself, well, here are these Christian Jews. If they take that to heart, will they also treat their Gentile brethren better as well? Okay. Do no harm. I mean, it's not a Hippocratic oath, but at the same time, that's what the law, the fulfillment of the law. Do no harm to another, whether physical, emotional, as best we can. Sometimes things that we do or say with regard to what God says, that people get upset about that, but with regard to our character and the things that we do, we should seek to have the benefit, to benefit another. Anything else for verse 10? Verse 11. Owen, did I see your hand? Nope, okay. Verse 11. And do this, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. For now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore let us cast off the works of darkness, let us put on the armor of light. It's interesting here in verse 11, there's 2 terms here for time that Paul uses. Do this knowing the time. That phrase, or that term time, is knowing the occasion, knowing the situation. And then when he comes down to it is high time, that term is hour, okay, literal time. And so when he says this to these brethren, of course, remember, they're sitting at Caesar's seat, all right, and they are going to bear the brunt of the initial backlash against Christians in the coming decades. As after Paul writes this, they're already dealing with some, but it's going to get worse for sure. And so when he says, knowing the situation, knowing the occasion, that now it is high time, that's the occasion, it is high time to awake out of sleep. Out of sleep of what? Obviously he's not talking literally, is he? So what kind of sleep and being awake is he describing? Okay, spiritual. And with regard to the spiritual characteristics that God commands us to have, putting those characteristics in application to conduct our lives in such a way that we will show that example. Okay, throughout the New Testament, when it talks about a light, okay, usually it's some sort of a positive influence. Jesus referred to our light on the Sermon on the Mount, let your light so shine before men. It refers to righteousness, goodness, that is intrinsic, the characteristic of God, that is to be in his people. And so when he says, it is high time to awake out of sleep, okay, it's time to put on those characteristics that are going to shine forth. Now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The occasion is, salvation is creeping closer every day. We're one day closer every day. And it is high time that we allow our character to shine forth to those around us, to be a benefit to others. Yes, ma'am.
Well, it almost sounds like a call to arms.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, oh yeah.
We've been waiting.
He even uses terms armor. Yeah.
We've been waiting for this person to come, but we're not in darkness anymore.
Right.
And you need to get up and get busy and get to work and realize that everything that's happened, so,
Yeah,
you know.
absolutely. Yeah, and the situation, here's the situation. You know, and especially despite the persecution that they are going to face, that's all the more reason to let their light shine. Doug?
Sometimes we hear the older generation say we're burning daylight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That means we're
Wasting time.
Yeah, we need to get busy,
Yeah.
get to work.
Right. Yeah. And of course, in this context, part of our work, can part of that be putting forward a good example? I mean, is being a good example to others all the time hard to do? Is it work? Yeah, it is. Whether you're an example to your neighbors, an example to your family, your wife, your husband, your children, your grandkids, you know, your neighbors, doesn't matter. It's work. It takes a lot of thought to make sure I'm filtering my words and my actions to make sure I'm not doing harm rather than good. I saw a hand over here somewhere, I thought. Did I? No. All right. So, verse 12, the night is far spent, the day is at hand, therefore let us cast off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light. So he describes the works of darkness versus the night being far spent. And of course, notice this verse 11, it's nearer than when we believed. And that's a past tense belief. It's when we first believed. Notice there's a single event that, does Paul still believe?
Yes.
Do the saints in Rome still believe?
Yes.
So what event when we first believed? What event was that?
Obey.
When they obeyed. And what did I do to obey? I was baptized. Yeah, I was baptized, I had my sins washed away. And so from that point, I left the night and I came into the day, didn't I? I left sin and I was supposed to leave the works of sin behind me, wasn't I? But what did Paul say back in Romans chapter 6? We've been baptized, we've been buried with Christ. What should we therefore then do? Yeah, we're to put to death the deeds of the body, walk as we're supposed to walk. So this kind of carries into not just the actual little application of most of chapter 13 of being a good citizen, but this is all kind of tying it together in the extent that this is all these characteristics. That includes the specifics of chapter 12. That includes the specifics of being a good citizen. That includes the specifics of doing good to our neighbor, loving our neighbor. And he says, let us put on, the night is far spent, the day is at hand. We're supposed to have the character of individuals who are Christ-like. So when he says in verse 12, therefore let us cast off the works of darkness, let us put on the armor of light. Okay, and of course that armor of light What do you think about when you think of armor of light? What other passage perhaps in the New Testament? Ephesians 6. Yeah, that's kind of the chapter we associate with the Christian armor. Okay, taking the sword of the Spirit, the helmet of salvation, the shield of faith, okay, the breastplate of righteousness, all these different pieces of armor that Paul relates to being spiritual pieces of equipment that we have. Well, that armor of light, does righteousness and having my mind focused on salvation, having the sword of the Spirit, are those things that people will be able to observe by my conduct? Yeah, in some form, some fashion, that's going to show in my lifestyle and the things I do or don't do. And so armor of light, light is something to be seen, okay, or to help you see something else. And it illuminates, okay, you could almost say from a metaphorical sense, it educates. And so that's what armor of light is meant to be. We're to put on that character of Christ and then let it help us teach others.
Well, I was just going to say, it may be a little out of context, but if you think about works of darkness as the old law and armor of light as the new law,
Sure.
Because there were things where
Maybe even more accurately, the Jewish way of serving the law.
Right,
Yeah.
the Jewish way of serving
Yeah.
the law, let me put it that way.
Yeah.
So, they needed to put off those petty things,
Right.
those things that they forced on other people.
Sure,
And
sure.
put on this new way of living.
Sure, and that goes into even more specific for the Jew, going back to Romans chapter 2, because of how they were treating the Gentiles, making a differentiation between the Jew and the Gentile. Yeah, sure. Yeah, that application's there. It's in that character. Verse 13, let us walk properly as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts. This is similar language from chapter 6 with regard to because we have been buried with Christ, we should no longer do these things, but instead we should actually walk as Christ walked. So let us walk properly. That term befitting, that which is proper, that which is expected of someone who has been buried with Christ in baptism, somebody who's been washed of their sins, as in the day. Okay, pure, holy, not in revelry and drunkenness. Okay, he's describing, this is similar to 1 Peter chapter 4, where kind of Peter describes basically what the works of sin are. It's not a comprehensive list, but he's describing a selfish, self-indulgent character. Okay, again, it goes back to character, isn't it? Revelry, drunkenness, excess, lewdness, and lust. The difference between lewdness and lust, on the one hand, lust is desiring, sinfully desiring someone else or something else. It's not necessarily just sexual. And then lewdness is seeking to be the attention of that desire, to be the object of that desire. Doing things, saying things, acting in such a way as to create lust in others. Strife and envy, again, that goes back to selfishness, it goes back to covetousness, it goes to the self-indulgent character, me, my way, I'm right, you're wrong, strife and envy. Anything so far to verse 13? Yes, ma'am.
Just this version, or this translation says gratify its desires,
Yep.
which means, that's kind of like scratching the itch. Don't be
Yeah.
scratching those itches.
Yeah. All human beings, and that goes back, so the urge might be a temptation, right? But to actually fulfill that temptation is what brings forth sin. And so, there are times where we're going to face temptation, but all of these are either actions of the body, and of course actions of the speech can be included in this as well, or actions of the mind. Okay, can I sin with my thoughts? That's what lust is. Okay, lust isn't just necessarily action. There are other sins attributed to the action because of lust. Lust itself is sinful desire, strong sinful desire. And so as a result, that's within me. That may not even, obviously if I have that, it's going to somehow show outwardly. but it's still just that having that action of the mind in and of itself is sinful as well.
Mike,
Yes, sir.
on this walk, that's our behavior.
Right.
He says, let us walk properly, behave properly as in the day. In here, of course, we're gonna act right.
Yeah.
Because everybody can see what's going on. But we're supposed to act that way all the time.
All the time.
Not only when people see us, but also when we're alone.
Right.
To act properly as we would in the day. And then he gives the list of things we could do that nobody else would know
Right.
about.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
and that's what I see the rest of this list of things you think you might get away with, but that's not how we're supposed to behave.
Right.
Not when people see, but I've heard people different during the week than they are on Sunday.
Sure.
I've heard people say, you mean he's a member of the church?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't see that during the week. His walk during the other days when nobody watches him, or a different set of group of people watching. I can't believe he even goes to church.
Right.
And you say he goes to church with you, then I really, that's what I see in that stuff. It's 100% of the
Right.
not just in the day when everybody's watching.
One time I saw some sort of a poster or something that says the true definition of character isn't what you do when you're with others, it's whether you do the same thing when you're on your own. Whether you're consistent in that characteristic. That shows integrity of character. It's not just putting on a face or a mask. It shows that I'm truly convinced and persuaded to live and think like this, whether anyone physical is watching or not. Of course, who's always watching? God. So we know we can't get away with anything as far as God goes. But in terms of people, sometimes people tend to act differently around others than they do by themselves or with their family. And a certain element, a certain non-sinful part of that, that's sometimes expected. You don't know other people maybe as well as you know your family, so you might be a little bit looser, relaxed, or whatnot with your family. But to put on some sort of sinful character when you're by yourself or not with fellow Christians, for instance, that's what's being described here.
I think, for me, a key part of that is make no provision. Let's just say I had an addiction of some kind, and I wasn't doing it, but I was getting as close to it as I can.
Yeah.
Walking down the alcohol aisle
Yeah.
at the grocery store.
Yep.
Or going someplace where if you believe smoking is wrong, which I do, I go someplace with a smoke-filled room.
Right.
I'm making a provision for the flesh.
Right.
And that's where sometimes I think we trip our own selves up because, I'll be okay, but in some ways I've gravitated to the thing, I am making a provision.
Right.
To fulfill that desire that's there. And that's where sometimes I've been tripped up, like thinking, I'll be okay, or
Yep.
whatever. And in reality, I should have been going 180 degrees the
Well,
other way.
And you know what? There's a term in the New Testament that, unfortunately, a lot of the newer versions, they don't translate this term the way I think the term. It's an interesting term. It's called shamefastness. Shamefastness. It comes up a lot in the King James Version, especially 1 Timothy chapter 2 is an interesting example of that. It speaks specifically to women and how they dress, but the characteristic that is being spoken of there is the recognition of that line between questionable and sinful and the desire to get as far away from that line as possible. Human beings, especially when we're younger, but it applies to us when we're older as well, a lot of times we want to push the envelope. Okay? Well, you push the envelope, you're going to keep going. Eventually you're going to go over that line that you thought you would never cross. Well, the character of the Christian never seeks to get close to that line, that pushing the envelope. It seeks to stay away from it. And so just kind of exactly what you're saying, you have a particular weakness to one aspect or another. That's not to say that in this world we're always going to be able to avoid those types of temptations, but as best as we're able, stay away. There's no reason to play with fire. What's the old adage? You play with fire, you're going to get burned. Any pyrotechnic will tell you that. So, yes, sir.
I remember a sermon I heard a while ago of this guy was looking for a driver, and he took 3 or 4 guys on this winding mountain road with, you know, skinny lanes and everything. He said, I want, you know, the best driver. I'm gonna let y'all go down this road, show me how well you can drive. You know, and everybody, and the guys went as fast as they could, get as close as they could to the white line, and then the last guy, he drove close to the center line, went slow, and that's the guy he hired because he drove the safest. So that's kind of
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, staying where you know nothing's going to, or at least to the best of your ability, to keep yourself in a safe place. Yeah, that is definitely the mind that a Christian needs to have. Yeah, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts. And of course, is this something, I mean, are we always going to be fighting something? I mean, all of us have strengths and weaknesses. There may be something that tempts you that wouldn't tempt me, but something that tempts me that might never tempt you. You know, we all have elements within us that, in some form or fashion, we know what areas are our weakest. And we need to make sure that we're very careful, because if we know that we have those weaknesses, who else definitely knows those weaknesses? Satan does. Yeah, and he's going to chip away, chip away, chip away. I mean, if that's the weak, I mean, you know, think about an army going up against to siege a city, and there's a weak, crumbly spot in the wall. Where do you think they're going to attack? You know, that's where they're going to go. Satan's not stupid.
Yeah, Satan will make it easy for us to make provision.
Oh yeah.
He'll clear the pathway.
Yeah, and sometimes he'll even make it look like this is the holy thing to do. You know, that goes back to what Paul warned about those who have a form of godliness but deny its power. So, yeah. Is that the first bell or second bell? First? Okay, good. All right. Question 10. What must we cast off if we are to wake up out of darkness? What does Paul say? Cast off what? Works of darkness. And then he includes some of those: revelry, drunkenness, lewdness, lust, strife, envy. Question 11. What is involved in our daily life if we have put on the armor of light? Specifically from chapter 13, let's say. If we're going to put on the armor of light, just from chapter 13, what does that mean that we must do? On a continual basis, notice this, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ. Have these people already been baptized? So then this must be a everyday thing, not just putting him on in baptism. They've already been saved. So this is an everyday thing, going back to walk, right? Yeah.
Love your neighbor no matter who that is.
Yeah, love your neighbor. That's one of the things that we must do in our daily life if we are going to wear the armor of light. We have to love our neighbor, and not just, oh, sure, I love my neighbor, you know, but then not actually act like it. We actually have to put it into practice. Yeah, or the easy ones. The people who love us and, you know, who are tickled to death to see us all the time, those people are easy to get along with. It's the people that perhaps we have personality clashes or whatever, for whatever reason. This person just doesn't like me, they have it out for me, you know, whatever it is. That's the hard one to make sure we continue to remember they have a soul. And even if they don't think they do or don't care about it, God did. Yeah, he did, and he still does. Right? Yes, ma'am.
It's my thought that during Bible times, you know, it was hard for people to be beggars, and people knew who the beggars were, right?
Mm-hmm.
Think of the society we live in today. We hear so many stories about people running cons, like I just read one or heard one the other day. Someone said it in here about a guy that said he didn't have any gas, and he leaned over and the gas tank was full. You know, we get approached by people all the time, asking us for money or whatever, and I mean, they are our neighbors, but I think we have to use some
Common sense.
common sense about, because the funds that we have are not ours.
Right.
They're the Lord's, and we have to be wise about what we do with those. So sometimes I do give because I believe it's legit, and other times I'm like, nah, this just
Yeah.
isn't. This
Yeah.
is very, and I don't have a measuring stick for that other than my gut.
Well, and you know, one of the things, because I've had people ask me, what should I do in these situations? Well, one example, there's an older fella in the church at O'Connor Road in San Antonio, Jim Lambert. Well, he's not there, and he's up in where he lives now. There's a congregation there now. But what he does, anytime anybody asks him for anything, groceries, whatever, he offers to take them to the gas station. He offers to take them. In fact, I've seen him and his wife take someone to the grocery store and get them groceries. And then if they decline that, they deny. I mean, if they're really in need, they'll be all for that. Absolutely, whatever you want to do, any help would be appreciated. But if then they're like, oh, well, that's all right, just the money would work, But then, after, even in situations that you think are legit, ultimately, it's our responsibility to help as we're able, right? But once we give that money to that individual, do we have any control after that? Does God know what that individual does with it?
Yeah.
Sure. But ultimately, we do the best we can to have common sense and to judge as best we can in a situation. But once we get involved in that, we do the best we can to know the facts. But after that, even if they are lying or aren't trustworthy, that's on them. Yeah. All right. What else would be involved in putting on armor of light, or involved in our daily walk of life? Wearing armor of light.
Studying His Word.
Sorry?
Studying His Word.
Okay.
We have to know God and know.
To walk properly, we know what's right and wrong, don't we? So the lewdness, lust, strife, and envy, we know His Word tells us not to do those things. And He does tell us to love our neighbor. So studying His Word will be involved in rightly dividing the word of truth. Okay? What else from chapter 13?
Follow the law. Follow the law. That
Follow the
is
law.
what you live under.
Right. Follow the law.
First, man's law second, another country's law.
Yep.
But just do what you're supposed to do in the eye of man, as long as it doesn't conflict
Right.
with God's word.
Are Christians supposed to be troublemakers? No. As much as depends on us, chapter 12, live peaceably with all men. Okay? We're not to seek to be troublemakers. In fact, we're to seek to be peacemakers.
Well, that's the shoes we're supposed to put on.
That's what we're supposed to do. Now it may not always work out that way, but it's not going to be us instigating it. All right, thank you everybody for the thoughts and comments. We will pick up chapter 14. The notes are in the back. Chapter 14 next week. Thank you everybody.